On his birthday, my son looked me in the eye and said, "You were never there for me." No warning, no hesitation, just a blade straight to the chest. The room seemed smaller after those words, the air thinner. Plates of food sat untouched on the table, the candles still burning on the cake, but I could barely see them. All I could hear was the echo of his voice, sharp, final, as if he had just sealed the truth of my entire life in one sentence. For a moment I thought I had misheard. I wanted to believe he was angry, exaggerating, letting the heat of youth twist his words, but no, his eyes were steady, cold, carrying the weight of a verdict that had already been passed long before I walked through the door. He wasn't just saying I failed once or twice. He was telling me my very existence as a father had been erased from his memory, as if nothing I had ever done counted. And that was the part that burned most. Because I had been there, just not in the ways he could see. I was there in the sweat that soaked my shirt during night shifts, when I traded my body for his textbooks. I was there in the silence when I swallowed my hunger so he would eat more. I was there in the shadows, invisible but constant, building a life for him brick by brick, dollar by dollar, while he slept in a warm bed I had fought to keep. But to him, none of that mattered. What mattered were the games I missed, the holidays I came home too late for, the moments when exhaustion stole my words. He remembered the empty seat at the school play, not the worn boots by the factory gate. He remembered the unanswered questions, not the sleepless nights I endured so he could dream without fear. As he said it, "You were never there for me," it felt as though every sacrifice had been swept off the table, crashing to the floor in pieces. Years collapsed into nothing. He didn't see the love that had hidden behind my absence. He only saw absence. And in his eyes, absence meant abandonment. I wanted to speak, to fight, to pour out every memory I carried like proof in a trial. But my throat tightened. What good would words do? Words had failed me long ago, when I tried to explain that love sometimes looks like distance, that presence is not always measured in hours but in sacrifice. So I sat there, watching my son look at me as though I had never existed. And for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own family. And yet, beneath the sting of betrayal, a quiet, dangerous thought rose. One day, he will see. One day, the truth will stand taller than his judgment. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and bring more powerful stories to life. And now, we continue. The silence after his words felt like a punishment heavier than anything I had ever endured. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to open my mouth and remind him of nights when I worked until my bones ached, of mornings when I left before the sun just to make sure he would never wake up hungry. But nothing came. My throat locked, as though my own body had betrayed me, refusing to let me shout the truth that lived inside me. The room carried that silence like a living thing, pressing down on my chest, filling every corner. It was not an ordinary silence. It was the kind that builds a wall between two people who should have been inseparable, the kind that whispers you have already lost the battle before it even began. He sat across from me, steady, unshaken, his eyes burning with the kind of conviction that cannot be reasoned with. It was as though my entire life had been rewritten in front of me, reduced to a single cruel headline, "Absent Father." I could feel the years collapsing around me. Birthdays I came home too late for, holidays when I worked double shifts while laughter filled the house without me. I had told myself then that he would understand one day, that children do not always see the sacrifices being made for them, but eventually they would. And yet here I was, face to face with the grown man my son had become, and his verdict was not gratitude, not even confusion. It was rejection. In his memory, I had never shown up at all. I sat with my hands trembling against my knees, wondering how love could look so invisible, how devotion could be mistaken for neglect. I remembered watching him sleep when he was small, vowing I would never let him feel abandoned. But what I thought was protection had become absence. What I believed was provision had become emptiness. I wanted to tell him that silence is not the absence of love, but sometimes its deepest form. That the reason I had no words then and no words now was because everything I wanted to say had already been spent in sweat, in missed meals, in broken sleep. Yet he would not hear it. His eyes told me that his truth was sealed, and my defense would only sound like excuses. So the silence remained, stretching between us like a canyon, each second longer than the last. I was still in the room with him, yet it felt as though I had already been erased. My love had left no evidence, and in that moment I understood. Silence was no longer my refuge. It was my sentence. Memories came flooding in, uninvited, each one cutting deeper than the words my son had just thrown at me. I saw myself back in those long nights at the factory, the air thick with smoke and grease, machines roaring louder than my thoughts. I remember the ache in my legs after standing 12 hours straight, my body begging for rest, yet my mind whispering only one thing: keep going. He needs this. Every shift I accepted, every hour I traded away from home, was not for me, but for him. While others slept, I worked. While others spent time with their families, I fed the machines, because tuition was due, rent had to be paid, and the lights in our small home could not go dark. There were dinners I missed, countless evenings where the seat at the table stayed empty. I told myself he would understand one day, that he would see that an empty chair did not mean an empty love. But all he remembers is that I wasn't there to pass him the bread, to hear his stories from school, to laugh at his small victories. He never saw the calloused hands that bought that bread, the weary smile that held back complaints, the shoes worn thin because I would rather pay for his books than for myself. I remember standing in stores, staring at shoes I could never afford, telling myself mine still had a few more miles left. Every blister I carried on my feet was a secret gift to him, every torn sole a hidden sacrifice. He walked into school with his head high, while I walked into work with my shoulders heavy, pretending my exhaustion was worth it. No one cheered for me, no one noticed. But wasn't that the point? A father is not supposed to be noticed. He is supposed to hold the weight so the child can rise. Yet those hours had no witnesses. No one saw me coughing in the bathroom from the dust that clung to my lungs. No one saw me count coins late at night, whispering prayers over each one, stretching them thin just to make another week possible. No one saw me stare at the ceiling in the dark, hands folded across my chest, wondering if one day my son would know that all I had ever wanted was to give him a life better than mine. But the truth is cruel. Those sacrifices live in shadows, not in memories. A child does not remember the hands that held back hunger, only the chair that was left empty. He remembers the silence at the school play, not the extra shift I took to afford his costume. He remembers my absence at his games, not the sweat that paid for his equipment. And now, as he sat across from me with fire in his eyes, it was as though none of it had ever happened. The hidden hours remained hidden, buried in shadows, unseen and unspoken. And as those memories pressed on me, one question hollowed me out. If no one remembers your sacrifices, did they ever matter at all? There was one place where my voice had never failed me. One place where my silence had finally broken into words. The old journal that sat untouched on a forgotten shelf. A worn leather cover, frayed at the edges, its pages filled not with schedules or numbers, but with the pieces of my heart I could never speak aloud. I had written in stolen minutes, sometimes on break at the factory, sometimes in the stillness of the night when the house was asleep, sometimes with hands trembling from fatigue, but unwilling to let another day pass without leaving something behind. Each entry was a confession, an apology for missing birthdays, a prayer whispered into the margins, a hope that one day my son would read and understand that my absence was not abandonment, but a trade, a terrible exchange of presence for provision. I wrote about the first time I held him as a baby, about the promises I whispered into his hair, promises I tried to keep even when life demanded a price I didn't know how to pay. I wrote about his first day of school, how I stood in the doorway watching him walk inside with a backpack too big for his small shoulders, my chest swelling with pride and fear all at once. I wrote about the shame I carried home each night when I couldn't be there at the table, about the hollow ache of missing his laughter echo through the house without me. The journal was my courtroom, my witness, my defense. In those pages, I explained why my boots were always muddy, why my eyes were always tired, why my seat was sometimes empty. I poured into it the words I never dared to say to his face, because I thought one day, someday, when he was older, when he was ready, he would find it. He would finally see the father he never thought he had. But there it sat, gathering dust, invisible like the hours of my labor, silent like the sacrifices that had no audience. He never asked about it, never knew it existed. And perhaps I was afraid to place it in his hands, afraid that even my most honest words would be read as excuses. So I left it there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when truth would need to speak louder than my weary voice ever could. Sometimes I would run my hand across the cover before leaving for another long shift, as though touching it gave me strength to keep going. Other times I would sit in the dark, pen pressed to paper, writing until tears blurred the ink, because I had no one else to tell. That book held everything, my failures, my hopes, my brokenness, my love. It was not perfect, just like me, but it was real. And now, as my son's accusation echoed through me like a verdict already sealed, I thought of that journal. It held the life he believed I never lived, the presence he believed I never gave, the truth he believed did not exist. The question that burned inside me was whether he would ever open it, whether he would ever see that his father had not been absent, only hidden. His words did not just strike me, they shattered everything I had built. His accusation was not a wound on the surface, it was a knife driven deep into the foundation of my life. It wasn't simply that he thought I hadn't been present, it was that the years I had poured out, the blood and the sweat, the hunger and the sacrifice, were invisible to him, as though they had never happened. And that invisibility, I realized, was my own doing. I had hidden my struggle from him. I had swallowed my pain, kept quiet, carried the burdens alone, believing that sparing him the weight was an act of love. I thought I was protecting him by never letting him see me break. I thought the silence around my suffering would keep him innocent. But silence had betrayed me. Silence had painted me absent. The betrayal cut both ways. I betrayed myself by choosing invisibility, by choosing to let him see only the results and not the cost. And now he betrayed me by believing the lie that I had simply abandoned him. The truth was twisted. My absence at the table, at the games, at the birthdays, was not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. I traded moments for survival, but in his eyes, survival did not matter. All he saw was the empty chair, the unanswered questions, the father who never seemed to arrive. I felt the weight of my choices pressing down like iron chains. Every late night I had stayed at work instead of sitting by his bed. Every sigh I held back so he wouldn't see how tired I was. Every penny I counted in secret so he could feel secure. All of it stood now as evidence against me, not in my defense. I thought I was building a shield for him. Instead, I had built a wall between us. And that was the breaking point. Not his words, not even his anger, but the realization that I had created this distance with my own hands. I had been so determined to give him a life without scars that I gave him a life without my presence. And now he carried a wound I had never meant to leave, a wound deeper than hunger or poverty, the wound of believing he was unloved. In that moment, I felt something inside me collapse. It was not just the grief of being misunderstood, it was the unbearable weight of knowing that love, when hidden too long, can look like neglect. That devotion, when silent, can look like absence. That sacrifice, when unseen, can look like betrayal. I sat there, my body still, but my soul screaming. Everything in me wanted to reach across the table, to grab his hand, to shake him and cry out the truth, that I had been there, that I had never left, that every breath I took was for him. But I didn't. The words withered before they reached my lips. I realized, with a sinking finality, that no explanation spoken aloud could undo the story he had already written in his heart. And so, the breaking point was not his anger. It was the quiet acceptance that I had become invisible, not because I chose to abandon him, but because I chose to love him in silence. And silence, once chosen, does not forgive. It only condemns. I rose slowly, not with fury, but with the kind of heaviness that makes the body feel older than it is. My knees ached, not from age, but from the weight of years spent carrying a love that had never been seen. I stood, not as a man defeated, but as a man emptied, with nothing left to give in that moment except silence. Anger would have been easier. It would have burned hot, left ashes, passed quickly. But what filled me was not fire. It was exhaustion, the kind that seeps into the bones, the kind that makes every breath feel like a burden. I looked at him one last time, wanting to hold his gaze, to let him see the storm inside me. But his eyes were already closed to me. He was convinced of his truth, a truth where I had never stood beside him, never fought for him, never stayed up nights so he could rest without fear. Words would not pierce that wall now. Arguments would only drive him further away. There are wounds that cannot be stitched with explanations. Some wounds demand time. Others demand silence. So I turned. The chair scraped back, its sound sharp in the stillness, almost violent in a room filled with unspoken accusations. My steps began to carry me toward the door, and with each one the floor seemed to echo louder than my voice ever could. I wasn't leaving in surrender. I was leaving because staying would mean pleading, begging for recognition that should never have needed begging. Love is not proven by speeches shouted across the table. Love is lived, and mine had been lived, even if unseen. As I crossed the room, the memories clung to me like shadows. Birthdays worked through, promises scribbled in journals, nights of aching silence. They rose around me, reminding me that I had not been absent, even if he believed I had. My heart whispered what my lips could not. If love must prove itself, let the truth speak for me when I am gone. The doorknob felt cold in my hand, as if it too asked me whether I was sure. But I knew. Staying meant drowning in arguments that would only deepen the wound. Leaving meant giving space for the truth to breathe, for time to reveal what anger now concealed. So I opened the door. The sound of it creaking was almost a farewell, and as I stepped out, I carried with me no victory, no relief. Only the bitter knowledge that sometimes the only way to love is to walk away. Not because you have stopped caring, but because caring too loudly would only make the wound bleed again. And so, I let the silence follow me down the hallway, each echo of my footsteps a quiet testimony that I had been there, even if he refused to see it. The room I left behind did not stay empty. Though my footsteps faded, though my voice had been swallowed by silence, something else remained in my place. On the shelf, unassuming and fragile, sat the journal. It had no voice, no defense, no argument. It was only paper and ink, yet it was truer than anything I could have spoken. My life had been poured into those pages, not as a record of events, but as a confession of the heart. Each line carried a piece of me that no one else had ever seen. Nights of labor written in words that bled exhaustion, mornings of prayer pressed into paragraphs of hope, afternoons of longing etched into sentences where I admitted the weight of my absence and the love that forced it. It was not polished. The handwriting wavered where my hands trembled after 12 hours at the factory. Some pages carried stains, oil from machines, sweat from my brow, even tears I had pretended never to shed. But that was what made it real. It was not meant to impress. It was meant to survive me, to be the quiet witness of a father's love no one else cared to see. Unnoticed, it had waited for years, waiting for the moment when my silence would no longer hold, when my son's anger would demand a truth larger than excuses. It waited like a loyal friend at the edge of the storm, patient, unguarded, plain. It never begged to be read, but it never stopped being there, ready to speak when I no longer could. And that was the cruel irony. The one thing that carried my voice was not my voice at all. It was the scratches of pen against paper, done in darkness when no one was looking. The journal did not accuse, it did not defend, it did not plead. It simply told the truth, line after line, as if whispering, "He was here. He was never absent. You just did not see him." The room might have felt empty after I walked away, but in truth it was not. My absence left behind a testimony stronger than any words I could have forced through trembling lips. The journal sat there, open, unprotected, waiting for his hands to reach for it, waiting for his eyes to be brave enough to look past resentment. It was no longer mine. It belonged to the moment when he would need it most. And though I could not stay, though I had walked away with nothing but silence, I left knowing this. Sometimes love cannot fight in the moment. Sometimes love must wait in the quiet, bound in pages, until the heart that rejects it is finally ready to hear. He sat alone in the room I had just left, the silence pressing harder than my presence ever did. The words he had thrown at me still burned in his chest, but something else had begun to stir in the ashes of his anger. His eyes wandered, not toward the door I had closed, but to the shelf where the journal rested. For years it had been nothing more than a forgotten object, a book without a name. Now it seemed to breathe, waiting, daring him to come closer. His hand hesitated in the air, as if touching it would break some unspoken boundary. Anger still clung to him, whispering that he needed no answers, that his judgment was already final. Yet curiosity pushed back, prying his fingers open, pulling him toward the thing I had left behind. He reached out slowly, almost unwillingly, and when his hand finally brushed against the worn leather cover, he felt the weight of something more than paper. He felt the weight of years. The first page opened stiff, as though it had been guarding secrets too long. The ink stared back at him, uneven, hurried, written in exhaustion. But as he began to read, the air shifted. Words he had never heard from me filled the silence. Apologies for birthdays missed, explanations for nights spent away, confessions of a father who had carried love in silence because he didn't know how else to give it. He read of mornings when I rose before dawn, whispering prayers that his life would be brighter than mine. He read of evenings when I walked home with pockets nearly empty, but a heart full of hope that he would never feel the poverty I had known. Every page was a fragment of love buried under survival. Every sentence carried both the burden of absence and the reason for it. He saw that I had not been careless, but careful, not absent, but hidden. He saw how often I had longed to be beside him, yet chose instead to work one more hour, one more day, to keep the house warm and the table full. And as those words spread before him, the anger in his chest began to tremble. His hands shook as he turned the pages, not because the book was heavy, but because the truth was. He had never thought of me as a man who prayed over him in silence, who wrote down his fears, who begged God and ink to make him strong, kind, and safe. He had never imagined that the father who missed his games also wrote about them afterward, describing how much he hated not being there, promising himself that one day his son would understand. The room no longer felt empty. It was filled with my voice, not loud, not spoken, but steady and unyielding on the page. He sat there alone with the journal open in his lap, and for the first time in his life, he began to see me. Not the father who wasn't there, but the man who had always been fighting to be there in the only way he knew how. And as his hands trembled over those pages, the certainty in his heart began to crack. He kept turning the pages, and with every line, the past he thought he knew began to unravel. His memories, the hollow chair at the dinner table, the empty bleachers at the game, the silence when he wanted answers, suddenly looked different when held against the ink of my journal. He read of birthdays I missed, but also of the reasons why. The double shifts I had taken so the lights would never flicker out, the late-night overtime that paid for the very cake he blew candles on without me there. He saw that my absence wasn't born of neglect, but of necessity, that each time I wasn't by his side, I was somewhere else, fighting to keep his world whole. He read of the tears I swallowed in parking lots, moments when the weight of failure crushed me, when I sat behind the wheel too tired to move, afraid to go home and see disappointment in his eyes. He read how I would whisper promises into the silence of those empty cars, promises that I would keep going, that I would never stop until he had what he needed, even if it cost me every drop of myself. He saw the hidden prayers, scrawled between shifts, asking God to make him stronger, gentler, better than I could ever be. His childhood, once painted only in loneliness, began to crack open and reveal something else beneath it. Abandonment was no longer the whole story. In its place, he began to see sacrifice. A father who missed moments not because he didn't care, but because he cared so much it broke him. The chair at the table hadn't been empty. It had been filled by the hours I traded in dark warehouses and factory lines. The missing cheer in the bleachers hadn't been silence. It had been the sound of machines swallowing my voice so that he could stand tall with new shoes, with books, with dignity I never had. He paused on one page where I had written about the night he won an award at school. I hadn't been there, but I described how I had asked someone to record it, how I had replayed the grainy video over and over during my break, tears running down my face in the corner of a noisy break room, whispering to myself that he was worth every absence. That page shook him. For the first time, he understood that I hadn't simply chosen work over him. I had chosen him through work. The boy he remembered himself to be, the boy who thought he was overlooked, suddenly collided with the truth of being fiercely loved, but loved in ways he had never noticed. And as he read, the certainty of resentment began to fade, replaced by a painful awareness. Love had always been there, just hidden in the places he never thought to look. His hands pressed against the pages, as if holding them down could steady the storm rising inside him. And for the first time, he began to wonder whether the man he had just accused of absence had, in truth, been present in every step of his life, just in ways he never understood until now. Each line he read seemed to lift a weight from his own chest, only to place it squarely on mine. With every entry, he realized that what he had carried as anger, as proof of abandonment, was never his burden to hold. It was mine. The nights he had spent wondering why I wasn't there, the moments he had filled with resentment, were not signs of indifference, but the scars of sacrifice. He began to see that absence, in its cruel disguise, had not been a choice of neglect, but the unavoidable cost of provision. The journal showed him a truth he had never considered, that silence is not always the language of distance. Sometimes, silence is what exhaustion sounds like when words have been spent on survival. He saw me coming home late, not because I wanted to miss him, but because I had no other way to keep the house standing. He saw the long pauses, the quiet dinners, not as proof that I didn't care, but as the weight of a man who had poured himself out in the hours before, too emptied to give more, but never unwilling to try again the next day. He realized love does not always announce itself with grand gestures or perfect attendance. Sometimes, love hides in the quiet persistence of labor, in the choice to keep going when every part of you wants to stop. He began to understand that my love, though quiet, had never abandoned him. It had been steady, patient, relentless, buried under the weight of bills, hours, and sacrifice. Love had been in the broken shoes, in the late-night journal entries, in the prayers whispered into the cracks of my fatigue. Love had been present all along, though invisible to him until now. The weight of realization pressed on him with a force he had not expected. The anger that had once burned so fiercely began to dissolve, leaving in its place something heavier. Regret. Regret that he had spoken words that could never be taken back. Regret that he had allowed resentment to blind him to the truth of the Father who had been there all along in ways he never saw. His hands trembled not from rage now, but from the unbearable recognition that love had lived in silence, and he had mistaken it for nothingness. And as the truth settled over him, he felt small in a way he never had before. Not because I had been larger than life, but because he now understood that I had carried a life too large for one man alone. The realization that my sacrifices had gone unseen cut him deeper than his own words had cut me. He sat there, the journal open across his knees, and felt the crushing weight of knowing that the Father he thought had never been there had, in fact, never left. The deeper he read, the clearer it became. The betrayal was not mine. It was his blindness. The journal laid out the evidence piece by piece, each entry dismantling his verdict with quiet, undeniable truth. My exhaustion was there in my shaky handwriting. My love was there in prayers written when no one listened. My regret bled through every apology scrawled in margins. I had not abandoned him. I had abandoned myself, my rest, my ease, to give him more. And as he read, the arrogance of his accusation began to reveal itself for what it was, blindness, not betrayal by me, but by his own refusal to see what had always been in front of him. He saw how easily he had turned my silence into indifference, how quickly he had mistaken sacrifice for neglect. He saw how carelessly he had built a false trial against me, with himself as judge and jury, condemning me without ever asking for the truth. He realized that his words had not uncovered my failure. They had only exposed his own. For in his anger, he had betrayed not just me, but himself, by choosing resentment over understanding. And that was the moment when the weight of betrayal shifted. It no longer pressed on my shoulders, but on his. He saw that I had carried my share already, that I had lived my life bent under the cost of love. Now it was his turn to feel the heaviness of what he had done, the years he had refused to look deeper, the accusations he had spoken without mercy. His eyes lingered on the lines where I had begged for forgiveness in silence, not because I was guilty of abandoning him, but because I feared he would never know the truth. The betrayal had never been my absence. It had been his blindness to my presence. And now, with the journal trembling in his hands, he could no longer hide from that truth. He was the one who had walked through life with closed eyes, and every page he turned forced them open wider. The verdict he had once believed so strongly in was gone, and all that remained was the quiet, devastating evidence of a love that had never stopped being there. The first tear fell without his permission. It darkened the paper, smudging the letters, making them bleed into one another as though the words themselves were breaking under his sorrow. Then another followed, and another, until the ink blurred beneath the weight of his grief. He wasn't just reading words anymore. He was touching wounds I had carried alone for decades. Every confession in those pages, every trembling line I had written in silence, now cut him open. It was no longer my burden alone. It had become his. He saw the entries where I whispered into the page, "I wish I could have been there." Simple words, repeated across years, filling margins with apologies no one ever heard. He realized they were not excuses. They were not weak attempts to cover failure. They were bridges, fragile, trembling bridges I had been trying to build from my exhaustion to his heart, bridges he had refused to cross. Until now. As his tears fell, they met mine, though decades apart. He could almost feel the nights I had sat hunched over that journal, pen scratching against paper with hands that shook too badly to hold steady. He could see me folding those pages closed, hiding them away because I did not know how to hand them to him without shame. He could hear the silence of my prayers echoing in the corners of every sentence, prayers that one day he would not hate me for the hours I had lost, but love me for the hours I had given. Each tear he shed rewrote the distance between us. The anger that had once kept him upright now left him trembling. He understood at last that every "I wish" was not a confession of neglect, but a declaration of love, love that ached, love that longed, love that refused to stop even when it was misunderstood. Those words became the first fragile rope thrown across the chasm that had grown between father and son. And though I was not there to see it, though I had walked away with nothing but silence, in that moment he began to reach for me through the margins. He began to understand that love does not always arrive in presence, but sometimes in absence that bleeds for the sake of someone else's tomorrow. His tears fell harder now, staining page after page until it seemed the journal itself was weeping with him, and for the first time his heart whispered something he had never allowed before, not judgment, not resentment, but the quiet, desperate question, how could I have not seen him? I lingered in the hallway, my back pressed to the wall, my hand resting against the wood of the closed door. I had left him behind, thinking the silence between us was final. But something in that quiet had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. It was softer, hesitant, fragile in a way that made my chest ache. I could not see him, I could not hear his breath, yet I felt the air shift, as though the house itself was carrying the weight of his awakening. My palm against the door trembled, not from weakness, but from hope I did not dare name. I had walked away because words had failed me. I had left because explanations only sounded like excuses. But now, beyond that thin barrier, another voice spoke for me. Not my tired throat, not my weary hands, but the journal, the only witness that had ever seen me fully. It carried my prayers, my confessions, my longings. It carried the truth I could never force upon him in person. And now, for the first time, I knew he was listening. A father does not wait for apologies. I did not stand there hoping to hear him cry out my name, or to rush through the door with regret spilling from his mouth. No. What I waited for was something deeper, understanding, the kind that does not come with words but with realization, the kind that doesn't erase the years but redeems them, the kind that tells you your love was not wasted, even if it went unseen. The door separated us, yet in that moment it also bound us together. He was on the other side, eyes scanning the pages that carried my soul. I was here, heart pressed against the silence, praying he would not close the book before it finished speaking. I felt the shift, not in sound, but in spirit. The kind of shift when a heart begins to soften, when anger begins to crumble under the weight of truth. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the wood. In the stillness, I imagined him turning the pages, his hands trembling, his tears falling onto words I had written years ago, never knowing if they would be read. And in that image, I found the smallest comfort. He was hearing me now, not my voice, not my excuses, but the raw truth I had left behind. For the first time in years, I did not feel invisible. He was seeing me, even if through ink. And as I stood there, alone in the hallway, I realized that sometimes the door between father and son is not an ending. Sometimes it is the thin wall that holds back the moment of recognition, the moment when silence stops condemning and begins to heal. Justice did not come like thunder. It did not crash through the walls with shouts or demands. It did not wear the face of vengeance, nor the cold weight of punishment. No, justice came quietly, almost tenderly, in the soft rustle of turning pages. Each page carried the sound of truth being uncovered, of blindness falling away, of a heart opening where it had once been closed. My son sat alone, the journal trembling in his hands. And for the first time in his life, he saw me not through the lens of absence, but through the eyes of recognition. Justice was not in making him feel guilty, nor in forcing him to take back his words. Justice was in that moment when he realized the truth for himself, that love had been there all along, hidden in silence, disguised in sacrifice. He saw it now, and that was enough. There were no speeches, no apologies that needed to be spoken out loud. The weight of truth was heavier than any sentence words could carry. Justice lived in the ache that filled his chest as he traced the lines of my handwriting. Justice lived in the tears that blurred the ink, binding his grief with mine. Justice lived in the dawning realization that absence had been love wearing a mask, and neglect had never once been part of my story. It was not the justice of a court, where one wins and another loses. It was not the justice of revenge, where wounds are returned for wounds. This was a deeper justice, the kind that restores dignity without demanding victory. It was justice born in recognition, the recognition that I had been there all along, that my sacrifices were not wasted, that my silence was not emptiness, but the echo of love too heavy for words. The room did not erupt in forgiveness. The world did not shift in some dramatic instant. It was quieter than that, softer. It was in the way his shoulders slumped as if finally releasing years of anger. It was in the way his hands held the journal not as a burden but as something sacred. It was in the silence that no longer accused but now understood. And though I could not see it from the other side of the door, I felt it. I felt justice arrive, not with a roar, but with the steady whisper of truth finally being heard. And in that whisper, I knew I had not been erased, my life had not been wasted, my love, though unseen, had not been lost. When at last he closed the journal, it was not with the same hands that had opened it. His fingers were still trembling, but not with anger anymore, only with the weight of recognition. The son who had once raised his voice like a weapon now sat in silence, the kind of silence that listens instead of condemns. He was no longer the accuser, no longer the boy who believed he had been abandoned. He was something softer now, something truer. He was the son who had finally seen his father, not perfect, not flawless, not always present in the way he had wished, but present in every sacrifice, in every hidden hour, in every prayer pressed between tired breaths. He saw me as a man, not a shadow, a man who had stumbled, who had missed moments, but who had carried the weight of love in silence because he didn't know how else to give it. For the first time, he saw that behind every absence stood a presence larger than words. Behind every quiet moment lay a love that had chosen provision over comfort, dignity over ease, him over me. He saw that my life was not made of grand gestures, but of 1,000 small choices that cost me more than he ever knew. And those choices had not been empty. They had built him. I had left the room without defense, without explanation, without fight. I had walked away carrying only silence, believing perhaps I had lost him forever. But the journal remained behind. That fragile book, forgotten for years, became the voice I could never find, the witness that refused to be erased. Its pages carried everything I had hidden, everything I had given, everything I had prayed would one day be understood. And now, at last, they spoke louder than my absence ever could. As he sat there with the book closed against his chest, he realized, love does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through exhaustion. Sometimes it hides behind weary footsteps and worn-out shoes. Sometimes it speaks not in presence but in sacrifice, and sometimes it waits, in silence, in ink, in the margins of a journal, until the day it is finally heard. That was the legacy I had left him. Not a legacy of perfect memories, not of constant presence, not of flawless fatherhood. My legacy was a testimony written in shadows and revealed in tears. It was the truth that love, even when unseen, does not vanish, that devotion, even when mistaken for absence, does not die, that a father's love, though buried under labor and silence, can still rise louder than accusation when the time is right. When he finally lifted his eyes, he was no longer looking for what I had failed to be. He was remembering what I had always been. And though I was not there to see it, though I stood behind the door still carrying the ache of his words, I knew something had shifted forever. He had seen me, truly seen me, and in that recognition, justice had come, not through my defense, but through the quiet testimony of a journal left behind. And so, in the end, it was not my voice that spoke loudest, nor my arguments, nor even my presence. It was the pages, the confessions, the fragile words I had once feared would never matter. They spoke, and they were heard, and in their echoes my love finally stood taller than my silence, stronger than his resentment, louder than absence itself.